Hey, why would you buy a house if you don't get to occupy it or possess it, right? So Section 6 deals with occupancy possession. When does that happen? And hey, once again, in this first section of A, you're not filling it out, but you need to know it. So I'm gonna read it. Stop me if there's something that jumps out to you. But it says, unless paragraph 6B is checked, which has to do with leasing and occupancy, the seller shall, at closing, deliver occupancy and possession of the property to buyer free of tenants.
Right. So one thing to note, when our contracts use the term shall, that means must. Doesn't mean maybe, doesn't mean has the option to do it or not do it. It means must. And I can tell you no sellers ever really read these provisions. And at closing time, what we get is the next sentence or the next sentence, which I'm sure if you've done enough closings
Yeah.
or know enough people who've done closings, this has become an issue at some point, which is at closing, seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage door openers, access devices, codes as applicable to buyer. So in the real world, what happens is the seller thinks, I'm not giving keys until I get my money. And you notice, and nowhere in there does it talk about seller's right to receive their money at or before handing over keys.
Yeah.
So what the contract sets up is to say, hey, buyer, under this paragraph, your rights is when you come in to sign, you're going to get possession and you're going to get keys from the seller.
And a house without trash.
Right.
And tenants.
So most of the time, the walkthroughs are done the night before or right before closing. And honestly, we haven't seen a whole lot of problems with that, but you may walk into a property that's not basically broom swept clean and free from personal property.
Yeah.
So I know the walkthrough has to be close to the closing time. Otherwise, you're going to get from the seller, oh yeah, I'm going to remove that all before closing. And you're like, well, then I'll just wait until you're done doing that. So I get that. If you're representing sellers, please have a conversation with the seller that they're receiving their seller proceeds does not mean the same as the requirement to deliver the keys and have a closing date, unless somebody has in the additional provisions wrote in, buyer will not receive keys until seller receives their seller proceeds.
Yeah.
That's how you would handle that.
All right. And gang, my personal opinion, it would go down in additional terms. I like to have that the seller will have the home professionally cleaned and provide receipts by X time and date prior to the closing. You don't want running down to the last wire, things like that. Am I going to lose a deal over that? No, but be specific, because nothing's worse than turning over possession and it's a wreck still, because it says shall, but that doesn't mean everybody does.
Yeah,
Right?
it seems like you have more of a buyer's angle.
I do.
Because if I'm representing a seller, and I know a lot of times the lenders are not ready to close on closing date, and I have to have it professionally cleaned and everything moved out, I would be concerned that I've got my moving van, I've got it professionally cleaned, all my stuff is out, and then the day before closing, I get a notification that, sorry, lender's not ready, we need a 1 week extension, and now I don't have my closing. So if you're representing a seller, it's not your job to tell them what to do, but to say, understand what could happen.
There you go.
Are you okay with that?
So that's a great point, because I'm looking at this from the lens of the buyer agent. He's looking at, but we also have to, we as listing agents get these contracts and we've got to translate it back to the seller. So thank you for that, because we need to say, now this could happen if closing gets pushed and it's cleaned and everything. Will you have a place to stay? Because we might have to wait a week or something. Not saying it will happen, but it could happen.
It happens all the time.
Yes. All right. So going forward, let's see.
Or buyer assumes all risks.
Yeah. If the occupancy is to be delivered before closing.
Never recommended. Yeah, last case scenario, you have no other options, but let me tell you what happens. If a buyer can occupy a property before closing, they will realize their neighbors are not nice, that airplanes fly close by, that a train goes by at 6 in the morning, that there's nicks in the wall, that the floors creak or whatever. So at all cost, avoid buyers preoccupying.
Yeah, definitely. So if they do, the buyer assumes all risks of loss to the property from the date of occupancy and shall be responsible and liable for maintenance from that date and shall have accepted the property in its existing condition as of time of occupancy. Now, you're going to want the rider, which is the pre-closing occupancy by buyer, but don't do your best. Don't do it. Don't do it.
So what I don't like about the pre-printed, let's say I'm a buyer and I've agreed to move into the property, whatever, because I'm military a month early or 2 weeks early, but my final inspection hasn't been done. And now all of a sudden my final inspection, or it's a VA loan, and the lender says, hey, the roof needs to be repaired or replaced as a condition of closing. If you read the black and white of this, it says the buyer shall be responsible and liable for maintenance from that date. So
it could be argued,
yeah.
Hey, you've accepted it, and that a roof could be maintenance issues, right?
Let me see if we can.
So let's check that out.
Yeah,
all right.
I don't know if the rider T goes into a. No, this version says reserved.
Okay. So I believe that has to do with the pre-occupancy closing rider,
Okay.
not the standard.
Gotcha. So normally what happens in pre-occupancy is the agents will call the closing company or me and say, can I do a pre-occupancy agreement? And I will, which is going to supersede and override this, which will ultimately make the seller still responsible for what I call major issues, roof structure, your standard stuff, and just kind of outlines that the buyer's not on the hook for 100% of everything.
Right. So the big part on section A is really all about the shalls. Be aware of that from the buyer side, the seller side, and the implications of that. And if best case practice is try to avoid at all costs, whether you're representing the seller or the buyer, the pre-occupancy. It happens, but it's not best. So let's look at line 73. Check this if the property is subject to leases or occupancy after closing.
So the way this works, let's say that you normally have two types of properties. You're going to have a single family residence, which somebody is doing a long-term lease. That's pretty clear. There's going to be somebody in the property. You're trying to do your inspections. They're like, listen, I rent here. How long is your lease? They either have a written lease or they don't. If they don't have a written lease, they're on a month-to-month, and the seller can basically get them out quickly.
Right.
If they're on a written lease by law, they have the right to occupy that through the end of the term of their written lease.
Yeah. They have a leasehold interest.
Correct.
Yep.
So the seller can offer them money to get them out early, or you are buying it knowing you cannot occupy that place until they vacate under the term. So you're going to want to get a copy of that lease. Or you're going to have what we call short-term rentals. And those are a little more difficult to deal with. If you're in the market of selling investment properties in Destin, you will run into this issue. And the issue becomes existing seller has either VRBO or rental management company. There are bookings out in the future. You are going to close at some point that involves bookings that are out in the future. What happens with those bookings? Are the bookings going to stay? Do they stay with the rental management company? Do they not stay at all? As a buyer, are you like, you people are crazy, you should be charging a lot more, I don't want any of those rental agreements? That all falls under this section. So let's try to go through that.
All right. So if a property is subject to a lease or an occupancy agreement, including seasonal and short-term vacation rentals, after closing, or is intended to be rented or occupied by third parties before closing or beyond closing, the facts and terms thereof shall be disclosed in writing by seller to buyer, and copies of the written leases shall be delivered to buyer all within 5 days after the effective date. That's when this contract goes into effect.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, again, that's an obligation of the seller to provide the buyer with any existing, and we call them leases, but again, when you're doing short-term rentals and you VRBO, usually that's done on a website.
Yeah.
You may have what we call reservations. But understand, the seller is supposed to print out whatever they have and give it to you so you have the opportunity to review. Does the future tenant or short-term rental have the ability to cancel and get their security deposit back? I mean, who's holding the security deposits? Usually the seller is. Did the seller actually get a security deposit? This is going to not do the best job of covering all these issues.
So here's what's important. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion, that means, do they like it? It's their decision, that the leases or terms of occupancy are not acceptable to the buyer may terminate this contract by delivery of written notice of such election to the seller within 5 days after receipt of the above items from seller, and buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing buyer and seller from all further obligations under this contract.
So from the buyer standpoint, the most important thing is identifying when the seller has first complied. Then you're on the clock for 5 days to either look at it and say, yep, we're good with this, or no, we're not, I'm canceling, and they're entitled to their EMD back.
So in that, it is important to the seller to get that data over to the buyer, and also inform your seller, hey, they have the ability, if they don't like these things, to walk at their sole discretion. And the buyer, hey, you have that if you don't like this. Because I have heard of some places where the rental company or management company is going, no, we have to continue beyond. And they can muddy the water of the transaction, trying to fight to keep them on their books.
Yes, so part of that is a management company is under contract with the seller. The buyer is not required to assume that contract, period. So if a buyer says, sorry, seller, that's your fault for signing a document that says if you sell the property and the management company can't relocate, you as a seller owe the management company their commissions that they would have earned. That's a seller problem, not a buyer problem. But a buyer needs to understand that the management contract, which the buyer may or may not see, is what's going to outline that.
And so in that, that's where you might have a seller that says, I will not sell to you unless you continue with the management company, because I don't want to be on the hook for having to pay this out.
Correct.
So those are terms, price and terms, that could factor into the conversation.
So the listing agent needs to have that conversation with the seller before it's even listed. And I understand you may list and it may not sell for 6 to 8 months, and bookings may come and go, and the seller may say, yeah, well, I'm willing to deal with that when that time comes attitude. But the more important thing is that you can, in retrospect, go back to the seller and go, remember we had this conversation and you said, let's just roll the dice and see what happens. They'll be like, oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot about that. It's not your fault now.
There you go. All right. So last little bit under this says, let's come down here, estoppel letters and seller's affidavit shall be provided pursuant to Standard D, except that tenant estoppel letters shall not be required on seasonal or short-term vacation rentals.
What that means is the seller has long-term renters in there. The seller is supposed to provide what we call an estoppel letter. What's an estoppel letter? That's just somebody giving information to somebody else that they're entitled to rely on. So the estoppel letter would be, I have a tenant in the property. They pay $500 a month. They're current on all their payments. Something like that.
Okay.
You can't really do that on seasonal or short-term vacation rentals because usually by the time the tenant's in there, if a seller were to do something, they're already out. So it kind of doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So look, if the property is intended to be occupied by the seller after closing, you would use Rider U, which is post-closing occupancy by seller. Sometimes they say I can close, but I'm going to need. Maybe they're going to go ahead and sell it, but they don't PCS for another 2 months. We'll rent it back. All of those particulars of that, they become a tenant for a period of time after that.
Yeah, and just like the pre-occupancy agreement, usually the agents will call me and say, Mark, can you create a post-occupancy agreement that has all the material stuff in it? And I do that.
All right. So anything else on Section 6 that we need to cover?
No, just if, it should be, if you're just doing single family residence, it should be black and white, whether or not there's a tenant in there. I mean, when you go do a walkthrough or whatever, or just ask the question. The harder part, again, is if you're doing condos in Destin, they're short-term or seasonal vacational, and you're not used to dealing with the issues, you may want to buddy up with a realtor who has experience doing that because just like everything else. Once you get your hands around it, it's not that difficult, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know.
That's right. All right. Hey, section 6 in the books. Way to go. Read back through it. If you've got questions, ask this guy. All right. We'll be back with you on section 7, assignability.